Firstly, a really warm welcome to this, the 34th talk in our virtually speaking series, which we started in the summer. I can say that this is hands down the most popular talk we've hosted, with over 225 households registered this evening. And I think it has the perfect combination of speaker and speakers and topic, the post-pandemic world. And I'll say a little bit about our speakers shortly. But since July, people from all over the world have signed up to hear experts from within the Latymer community talk on subjects as diverse as Flaubert, Margaret Thatcher, COVID vaccines, and jazz. And we're really grateful to all our speakers who've shared their knowledge with us and helped to while away the long evenings of lockdown. Now, as you can imagine, all our usual events which raise money for our bursaries appeal have been cancelled since March. So these online talks have helped to raise much needed funds for our bursary programme, around £18,000 so far. And I'm really grateful to all of you listening tonight who've made a donation when registering for this talk. I'm really pleased to say that we've already raised £1,500 this evening. And of course, there's still time to make that more. We have seen an increase in the number of young people needing bursaries if they're to join us in September. And you don't need me to tell you that the pandemic has only exacerbated that disadvantage gap, which our bursaries can do so much to address. So your support is vital to us if we're to achieve our aim, our campaign, our Inspiring Minds campaign aim, to be able to offer a bursary to 1 in 4 of our students. And if you'd like to make a gift and haven't done so yet, there will be a link in the chat. So I mentioned our speakers, and it really is an honour and a privilege to introduce them. Not that they need much introduction, certainly from me, but in Bill Emmott left Latymer in 1974 and has enjoyed a distinguished career as a journalist and author. And one thinks in particular of his editor-in-chief role at The Economist, 1993 to 2006. Stephanie Flanders, a Latymer parent, but perhaps better known as the BBC's economics editor for 5 years before she joined JP Morgan as their chief market strategist for Britain and Europe, and since 2017 heading up Bloomberg Economics. And so really it's hard to think of 2 better people placed to speak on this absolutely key topic. I'm totally convinced that there will be lots and lots of questions. Please drop them into the chat as they occur to you, because Stephanie and Bill have very kindly offered to field them almost as they go, and that will be amazing. So otherwise, if I can encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to mute yourselves, and then that will avoid any feedback or distraction for Stephanie and Bill as they address us on the post-pandemic world. Bill, Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Stephanie, over to you.
We have a whole post-pandemic world to describe, and not so long to describe it. But I agree with David that you're a great person to discuss it with.
Well, I'll kick things off, and then I'll put a question to you, perhaps. I mean, why am I? Well, I'll only say that I have formed a sort of group of people. I'm calling grandly, probably over grandly, the Global Commission for Post-Pandemic Policy. And this is now 32 sort of luminaries from around the world, former ministers, 2 Nobel Prize winners, and all of this, to try to think through what's going on and where it might go. And you probably all want to know what they think. And the answer is that I can't really tell you, because we've only just started talking, which is a way of saying also that we're not anywhere near the post-pandemic world yet. We're still in the pandemic world. And that's, I think, the first thing to say. Second, I think that as we look at the world now, we can see vaccination as being one of the key issues, sort of bringing us light towards the end of the tunnel. But one of the key lessons, and I'd be interested in your view, and this came in a conversation I was having, another event I was doing the other day, I was very struck by. I mean, we've had fiscal support programs, economic support that's now, if you add it up worldwide, goes into the trillions. But worldwide, what we've spent on vaccines is about $20 billion. And if we'd only spent 200 billion, and now we need to spend another 200 billion, then we'd have saved an enormous amount of money. It's probably the most clear cost-benefit analysis situation that there's almost ever been, where it's so clear that we should be spending much more on vaccination and on research into the next vaccines, but we haven't. We've done pretty well. I mean, I shouldn't knock it. We've done, indeed, scientists have done remarkably well in getting to vaccines and so many vaccines so quickly, fantastically well. But what it tells us is how difficult it is to spend money and to make investments, and indeed preparations, about the future. Since we're here to talk about the post-pandemic world, we should be humble and say we also should find it hard to talk about the future. But why do you think public policy found it so difficult to react, in a sense, in a kind of not generous, but in an adventurous way?
Well, yes, we are all humble, and as they would say, you know, we have a lot to be humble about. But I think if you look back at last year and then think about the things that we thought we were prepared for and we turned out not to be prepared for, I think the vaccines is an interesting example, because actually the investments, though probably not enough, that the UK had done in its vaccine industry, and indeed private sector had done in its vaccine industry, I think are part of how we've had this extraordinary achievement on the scientific front, which we shouldn't begrudge. And those of us who perhaps don't understand it as well as scientists should be especially realise its significance. A much greater contribution than economists arguably made in the lead up to this. But the other set of preparations we had, which we were also very proud of and thought was best in class, turned out to be not ready, fit for purpose at all. And that's, of course, the pandemic preparedness, that Britain had famously come top of all of these rankings on that. So I think it was an interesting case study that actually, although we could have invested more, we had in fact done some of the groundwork on the science, and thank goodness, because it has enabled us to achieve at least the success that we have. But when we thought we were preparing for this very different world of a pandemic, we really hadn't grappled with that at all. And I wonder also whether that's a lesson for when we think about trying to confront climate change. Will we be humble, and will we really try and think about what it will do to the world, how the world changes when you take seriously these forecasts, and maybe the difficult things that you need to do now that you don't want to do. I was very struck, if we go back to last year, what makes me humble as an economist, and I know we're on much more comfortable ground thinking about economics, was how slow we were to see how much the world was going to change and was changing. Even given all the evidence. You know, if I think back to my days at the BBC, I always remember that, and you will have looked at these in the past, the UK Treasury, I think under the Gordon Brown years, started collecting all the forecasts for the UK economy, and then it would come out every month. And they still do that, and it's always quite useful just to see where people are. But if you look at the forecast for January of 2008, for the UK economy, this was after Northern Rock, after we knew there'd been a big crunch in credit markets and a big fall in the housing market in the US that was causing a lot of concerns for things like for banks and others. Even though we knew all of that, not a single one of the 50-odd forecasters for the UK thought we were going to have a recession or even a very severe slowdown in 2008. And I'm always struck by that even the January of that year, which turned out to be, well, before this year, a record-breaking decline in GDP, a shrinking of the economy, no one saw it coming, even given all the signs. And we had exactly the same thing, arguably, at the beginning of last year. I had economists and reporters for my group at Bloomberg sitting in China. We rather prided ourselves on being ahead of the curve in seeing how it was affecting the Chinese economy. And we also took the extra leap to think about how the Chinese or Asian impact the pandemic, the effect on the Chinese economy, what was that going to do to the rest of the world, and how it might affect the UK, that China was having this problem. I mean, a few weeks later, I thought, why didn't we make the leap to think, well, okay, what if everything that's happening in China actually happened everywhere? What does that mean? And we were remarkably slow in retrospect to make that very obvious leak. And of course, anyone more listening will think, well, you've got a load of stupid economists, but it wasn't just us. It was the government, everybody, was just that failure of imagination. So you're right, there's a thing about how you invest, but good investing also requires imagination and a willingness to put together dots that actually historically we've not been very good at putting together.
No, and I suppose intellectually what it reminds us is that economics is a social science, and the pandemic has told us that epidemiology is a social science. We've learned how to pronounce the word epidemiology, but it's all about how humans behave and how they react. And then how a virus moves between them. And one of the most irritating phrases, as I think throughout the whole thing, has been the phrase "follow the science," which has failed to acknowledge the fact that there is some science you can follow, which is perhaps virology, with the actual science of vaccines and of understanding the enemy, if you like. But the sense of how things are going to develop is epidemiology, and that's a social science, and is as hampered as economics is in anticipating human behavior and social reactions. Now, that's not to say we should throw up our hands in the air. I think one thing that we must think about for the post-pandemic world is to learn from the successes and the failures of the past 12 months and of what will be, at least the next 12. And one of them is that we have to learn from other countries and what did work well. I think a dispiriting thing in the first 6 months, at least, of the pandemic was how resistant our political classes, and I don't mean just in Britain, I mean in all sorts of countries, and I tend to think in a rather global way rather than a British way, is one of my sins. But I think we resisted learning from each other and from understanding what was going on elsewhere. Now, when we look at, well, what things how could we prepare better for the next threat? Let's call it another pandemic or perhaps a bioterrorist attack. Actually, the countries that have done best, which are pretty much all in Asia, are ones that were really well prepared, not in technological terms, but in terms of the sort of surveillance systems that public health, rather old-fashioned public health centers and public health networks gave them. Japan, country one of the ones I know best, basically has been lousy in certain ways of dealing with the pandemic, terrible at setting up testing, but actually brilliant at chasing down clusters of infections through essentially a nationwide network of nosy public health nurses who know everything that's going on in their little community and are able to track you down. And if we're going to prepare well for the next pandemic, we do need good technology, I'm sure, but we also need some of that old-fashioned sort of outbreak surveillance systems that perhaps countries that have had more recent experience of infectious disease than countries in Europe or North America have had, and to build up that sort of immediate knowledge network. And I don't know how easy it would be to do that, but one of the lessons of the last year is actually the failure of apps, it seems to me, the failure of smartphone technology as a way to do things. Almost everywhere except Taiwan and South Korea, they've really not been a success. So let's not be negative. Let's look to the future. I think one of the future questions in the economy, let's move to our comfort zone for a moment, is that I think there will be quite a bounce back, because we've got, unlike after 2008, we've got an enormous sort of sense of built up savings ready to be spent. A lot of built up consumption is going to be there. But my question is, what will be the scars? What scars is this one going to leave? Whether it's in unemployment scars because of long-term unemployment, or bad debts going to hit the banking system. Have you done any sort of scar detection work?
Well, I mean, our economists have certainly looked at where we think the SCARI could end up, but of course, it's in a sense everything to play for, because as we know in Europe, in particular, you have people held in suspended animation at this point in jobs that may or may not turn out to be viable jobs once the furlough is lifted. But just to go back a little bit, I mean, I do think when we think about the immediate post-COVID world, are we going to have what's the recovery going to look like this year? I think of it as there's almost a sort of two sleeping giants, and we're not quite sure how the two will interact. And you've touched on both of them, but one is this suppressed demand. And if you put a financial number on it, I mean, obviously it speaks to some great inequalities in the way the pandemic has hit. But for one reason or another, one of our economists for the UK, an ex-Treasury person, calculated that there's now 91, in fact, a few months ago, there was £91 billion worth of excess savings sitting in bank accounts around the UK, in the UK household sector. Now, obviously, not everyone is feeling cash poor, but that is suppressed demand, which could be part of the kind of bounce back of consumption that you talked about. And obviously, how quickly and when it comes back and what extent will depend on this people's happiness to go out and spend, and how quickly we get through the vaccine rollout. And I think the difference between UK and Europe could end up being critical for some of for example, in the tourist sector. If people in Britain, for the sake of argument, feel much more comfortable from May or June going out and spending relative to many in the Eurozone, just from losing those 2 months, that could be quite important. So we're looking at that as a big positive, and how much are we going to get from that? It may even cause a bounce in inflation in some sectors. But the other side is the hidden unemployment. So you've got the hidden demand and the hidden unemployment. People who are currently formally in jobs, who are being paid by Rishi Sunak, or at least having a big chunk of their income paid by that. And when the dust settles, when the world is starting to go back to normal, do they still have a job? Or are they in fact unemployed? And then, I mean, this goes to one of the big debates about the government response to the pandemic in different parts of the world. We clearly had in Europe, in UK and the Eurozone, a big desire to preserve jobs, which was reflected in the furlough. But you have in the US a willingness, perhaps a typical willingness, to allow for a bit more creative destruction, as they would call it. Temporary increase in unemployment benefit, but a willingness to see tens of millions of people go onto the unemployment rolls. Now, your former magazine, The Economist, has argued actually that the US is looking a bit better for having done that, because it'll have a quicker adjustment, and lots of people have already moved into new jobs. I wonder I don't know whether you agree with The Economist on that. I think probably the jury is still out, because we just don't know what the permanent effects are. We don't know how many of these jobs will turn out to be viable. What business models are going to be redundant as a result of the pandemic, and which ones will still be there. I'm okay with the government having erred on the side of caution on that, but you may disagree.
Well, I think that in terms of GDP, I think the US is going to bounce back faster than European countries, and will return itself more quickly to its pre-COVID level. But it will leave, I think, scars. And one has to remember that after the 2008 crash, the labor force participation rate in the US went down. It came up in the UK, but it went down. People were leaving the workforce because they didn't think it was worthwhile to look for a job, or other reasons to do with opioid addiction, for example, and other sickness, drug problems, restrictions in the labor market, thanks to not being allowed to look for certain jobs because they were convicted felons, that sort of thing. All sorts of things weighed down on the labor market. And I suspect that will happen again unless the Biden administration and Congress is able to lean hard on it. In other words, although creative disruption absolutely is going to be working more efficiently and quite effectively in the US, the next question is, as were the welfare response, which is a response, I think, that has to be about enabling people to look for and find new jobs. And that's what the US has always been worst at. It's great at destroying old and creating new, but not good actually at directing people to new jobs or providing any support while they're there. And the second question that comes out of all of this is going to be about inequality. I don't know about you, but certainly in the elections, the US elections and British elections, but particularly US elections where I was still at The Economist, each time I was thinking, I wonder if inequality is going to be the big issue in this election, and it never was. Maybe slightly in Bush v. Gore 2000, but mostly it wasn't. And then you got the election of Donald Trump, which was partly an inequality vote, a sense of, as it were, the left behind, the forgotten. But is it now going to be on the American political agenda? Is it now really going to be on the British political agenda? Trying to not just level up in terms of regions, as the British government has talked about, but rather in terms of the income distribution. In that I do think that we, as liberals, have a problem that's built up over decades, of which is a widening of income distribution. And I think that obviously we shouldn't intervene too aggressively about that. I'm not a socialist in that sense, but I do think that there's a limit, and we have to basically invest in citizenship and a sense of equality. And one question to me out of this pandemic crisis is whether or not there will be a new political mood towards investing in equality, just as another question has to be about climate and about the positive mood that there is now about public investment after a long period of public investment being out of fashion, whether that public investment will be directed towards real changes in infrastructure that enable the transition in energy systems, for example.
Yeah, I mean, clearly inequality is, we all feel that there's going to be, at least for a while, more of a focus on that. And I was struck by, actually not an economics book, but there was a phrase from a book called Underland by Robert Macfarlane, the writer, and he talks about unburials. And when he's talking about in the Arctic Circle and other places where things that we thought were going to be long buried for hundreds of years, or things that were buried 100 years ago, are being unburied by climate change and coming to the surface when people weren't expecting them, dead animals, whatever it might be. And I feel like a lot of things got unburied by COVID, things that we knew about that were under the surface, but are now very much harder to ignore. And it's not just the financial inequalities. We saw just absolutely with precision, really, in the way that COVID hit, how the economic inequalities have gone with social and health inequalities, particularly in the UK, but obviously around the developed world. And I think that's something that will stay with people. How that translates into a coherent levelling up agenda, I think, is a big question facing lots of people at the Treasury now. And I'm not sure there are easy answers, but I do wonder whether, if you're going to take it seriously, I think you have to take seriously sort of two aspects of the crisis. One is just the inequality in the impact of the crisis. And if you're going to then have a policy response in the next few years and maybe a readjustment of spending and taxes, I think that should reflect the inequalities that we saw in the impact of the pandemic. So I talked about the savings sitting on balance sheets. I'm not suggesting we take them all away from people, but I suspect that what Rishi Sunak decides is, when he's thinking about ways to start to reduce government borrowing, and I hope he doesn't start too quickly, I think that he will want, at least in principle, to be looking at some of the areas that have done particularly well in the last year, and that would be from a corporate sector standpoint, but also potentially people who've been sitting on assets that have gone up in the financial markets at a time when others have been losing their jobs. I don't know, but I think that, as I say, that would make sense to me if you allowed your difficult decisions to be sort of pushed in that direction. But I think one of the other lesson, which is more about practical policy, is what we learned about the state and the nature of the state in the UK in its response to COVID. Now, this would be true in lots of places have learned. You pointed to things that the Japanese have learned they're not so good at and things they are good at. I think we discovered, or were reminded, that we had a very centralized state, but has actually not got very good top-down control. So you have a sort of bad combination. You know, we thought the NHS was going to serve us in great stead because it was so centralized, but actually we've been decentralizing it in many ways. And some of the middle pieces, the regional bodies that they got rid of in 2012, I think might have been helpful in trying to lead the response, and certainly in joining the dots with social care, for example, which got lost in some of the reforms of the last few years. So I hope that when we're thinking about positive reforms coming out of this, thinking about what is an effective state in the UK these days, what's needed for that, and I think particularly a bit more control for local areas, and a more mature relationship between local and central government in this very centralized country, I think, and a country that's very much run by Whitehall. I think if there's a bit of that,
I just lost the very last part of what you said, Stephanie, but nevertheless, it might just have been my internet. But, the technology is good, but not quite as good as it maybe needs to be. I mean, yes, I certainly think there's going to be a lot of attention to the state, and also the nature of public services, the nature of as it were, what it is that governments should be investing in after a long period of cuts. I'm worried also, though, about, if you like, the global superstructure, and I think we should just touch on that for a moment. I think we want to come to some of the excellent questions that are flowing in a moment, but I just speak up for, as it were, global governance. I think that one thing that we've seen in this crisis has been the magnificent scientific collaboration that there is, and that there has been, but we've seen equally a huge vacuum in terms of governmental collaboration. And that's particularly the absence of, if you like, a G20 type economic response, but also any collaborative health response. And I think a big question for the post-pandemic world, and that we need to work on, is how to re-establish global collaboration, given that, as it were, the cliche about this whole thing is that we've learned that we're all in it together. Now, as we come out, a critical question is not just how quickly are we vaccinated, but how quickly everyone else across the borders are vaccinated. And we share an interest in accelerating the global vaccination program, even if we're very pleased if our vaccinations happen faster. We need everyone's to do it, but we haven't got good collaboration to achieve that. And that's particularly a question of the US and China. But it's also a question of two things, I think. One is the decline in general sense of US leadership that dates back well before Trump, but certainly exacerbated through him. But second, and quite critically, I think that the model of global governance that was all about building institutions, whether they were the European Union or the World Health Organization or the IMF, the WTO, whatever, seems to have shuddered to a halt, at least in terms of the conviction that we all feel in it, that sort of big institutions that have lots of officials sitting in Washington or Rome or somewhere in the world don't seem to be very good and agile, and are distrusted by the powers that provide the money, and that we may need to find new ways to collaborate more nimbly, I think, between the powers. Maybe it's the global equivalent of intergovernmentalism in the European Union. But I think it's easy to say we need to reform the UN or reform UN institutions, but actually what we may need is to not do things in such an institutional way that then lead to enormously slow responses and intense politics. But so that's one of my worries I want to put on the table about global governance. The other worry I think we see in all of this is about trust in facts and information. Politically, but also in terms of the pandemic, conspiracy theories have run rife. and social media is part of that, but it's probably only the current agent of the problem. Although, as has been said by Sacha Baron Cohen and others, if Goebbels had Facebook and Twitter, think what Goebbels could have achieved. They are very, very powerful platforms, and I think we need some new consensus about regulation of social media platforms and perhaps of other communications in a way that's compatible with liberal free speech, but that doesn't allow or doesn't foster, at least, the conspiracy theories to get in the way so badly as they have done.
Yes, I think that I mean, there's a lot there, and I'm not sure we have solutions for any of this. And I'm always nervous of creating another international institution, that's for sure, because one observes in life that they never go away. However irrelevant they become, you never actually see one being disbanding, including some of the UN ones that you just can't imagine what they still do. But anyway, I think if one's trying to be, I'm looking at lots of the questions and I'm thinking we could easily get very depressed about the scale of the challenge, especially when you start talking about social media and the distrust of experts and truth. But I think there are glimmers of actually Europe, funnily enough, being a source for constructive global leadership on some of those key issues, whether it's digital taxation or regulation of social media. There has been, and certainly of privacy issues, there's been some, I think, quite constructive first beginnings for the European Union to be charting a course where other governments have not been successful. As I say, it's only early stages. I mean, they certainly haven't got to the bottom of regulating Facebook and others, but I think that they're starting to see a sort of an approach. And actually, if we think that some of those big issues are to do with the regulation of companies whose scale and influence is now mightier than even some of the largest governments, if it's how are we going to regulate and deal with the consequences of those extraordinary companies that we've just not seen in human history, we are going to have to work together, but we're probably not going to all be able to work together at the same time. And if Europe starts to plot a way of doing it, at least within the European Union, being such a large market, being such a large part of the global economy, I think that could be a helpful and a hopeful step for the future. But I don't underestimate the problems, and I recognise, even for myself, that I'm astonished. I'm highlighting the European Union's success at regulation, but I do think in some of those areas there's a little bit of hope. It certainly is the challenge that we have to face. You mentioned at the start about vaccines, and I do think it's probably worthwhile going back to it, because there's quite a lot of questions about that, including Joy Georgie, who says that, given that, as the WHO puts it, no one is safe until everyone is safe, which is definitely true. Would it make both economic and political sense for vaccines to be shared more equitably throughout the world? Well, I think it's unarguable that it would make more moral sense. And I think it will come back to haunt us if we continue to have such an unequal distribution of vaccines, given the potential for variants to appear. And I just wonder whether we're going to end up making some of the mistakes that we've made in the past of underestimating what the impact on us is going to be of problems elsewhere. When we think of, there's quite a few climate change activists who've drawn the comparison with COVID and said, hang on a minute, all these years we've been suggesting a fraction of the economic interventions that governments have done in the last year in response to COVID in order to combat climate change. And you've said it's unrealistic and too costly, and that government can't intervene and can't ban these things. And yet somehow, when it was necessary for advanced economies, we were able to take those difficult steps very, very quickly to respond to the pandemic. And they look at that pandemic example and they say, why can't we channel some of that same willingness to take tough decisions in confronting a danger when it comes to climate change. And I'm afraid one of the answers that people come up with is because, well, in the first analysis, the big economic harms that are being felt and the human harms from climate change are all in countries quite far away, that are not right now, are not advanced economies, not the ones that need to take the actions. Do you think there's something in that, Bill? I mean, I say that's the sort of radical climate view of the last year, that we've only done all these dramatic things because it was affecting us, and we still may not do the right thing quick enough when it comes to climate change.
Well, I certainly think that that's absolutely true, that we invest money in dealing with diseases that will kill us, rather than necessarily that will kill other people. And that's what Bill Gates has been trying to campaign against for the last 15 years, with his funds. And clearly with climate change, that's true. I think that the real problem with climate change is that it's damage in the future, and it is damage that's uncertain. And that's what holds us back, and that Emmanuel Macron tried to put on a high tax on motor fuel in France in order to start the move towards dealing with climate change, and he got the Gilets jaunes protests because it was pain first, gain later. So
and they lowered the speed limit at the same time, which was the real kicker by all accounts.
Yes, exactly. So I go back to my starting point on vaccination. I think that if I was writing a leader in The Economist now, I would say take what we've spent on vaccination and multiply it by 50, and you should spend it on vaccinating the world, as building up production of the current vaccines, distributing them more widely, but secondly, invest money in research into the vaccines to protect against the next strains, against the mutants, the mutations that are going to come, because we need to be anticipating this now. And it's clear that the risk-return ratio on money spent in this is enormously well rewarded, and the technology has become very favorable. The messenger RNA technology that's come has been shown that it's absolutely brilliant. It's the product of genomics and great research. We can really make great gains in this area. Climate change, I think it's not easy to apply exactly the same analysis to, but because it's a slow process, it's a gradual process rather than something that clearly is going to hit us immediately. It's an adaptation process. But two things we can take. One is if we are investing money, public investment, we can invest in accelerating the change in energy infrastructure, which holds back some of the move away from fossil fuels. But secondly, the big issue with climate change is the risk of tipping points, of sudden changes that were pretty hard to predict when they might happen. But if they do, a mass release of methane from under the tundra or frozen earth, for example, or changes, as has often been worried about by Al Gore and others, about changes in ocean currents. We can invest in the sort of knowledge, at least, of the geoengineering solutions that might be conceivable in reaction to those risks, and in trying to plan ahead so that if we had a climate crisis that was really hitting us like the pandemic did over 1, 2, 3 years, we would be prepared to be able to bring about some of the sort of dramatic geoengineering solutions that are possible, but they're rather hard to plan. And so we can make preparations of that type.
I guess one of the points, just in response to the first point, I mean, I think a lot of people with a global view of the impact of climate change would say that it isn't distant anymore. There is real and immediate, and there's tens of thousands of people dying every year. These climate experts would argue, because of the real effects now. It's just it's locusts that are 10 times the size of normal locust swarms hitting the Horn of Africa. It's not what we saw with the pandemic, and that makes the difference in terms of the ability to act. But I hope that there will be, I would say in the financial community, it may be 10 or 20 years too late, or at least later than it should have been. But there has been a palpable change in the mood around this issue, and an understanding that shareholders are going to punish companies and banks for not, if you like, getting with the program. And it will be interesting to see how long that lasts, or whether in the end, when things start to get difficult, you find that some companies are willing to run the gauntlet and see whether they'll continue to get shareholder support, even if they're not doing, quote unquote, the right things on climate. But there's so many questions on other things. I feel like we should go to some of the other aspects of the post-COVID world that you point out. We're not post-COVID at all yet. But one of the things was about what's going to happen to innovation and creativity. So Stefan Horstman saying, what will happen to the world of work, offices and office work, traveling for meetings? Is the 5-day week dead? And what will happen to innovation? I think this again is one of the hopeful things that one could say from experiencing the last 6 to 9 months, that we've had advances in productivity at least, and moving online, that we wouldn't have, in a very short period, that we might have expected to take a very long time in the future. I'm probably not the only one who's a bit fed up with online working. I don't think we're all going to end up staying at home 5 days a week, God help us. I certainly don't think the experiment with homeschooling is one that I will want to continue, despite Latymer's fantastic achievements on that front. But there is a question about, people have very quickly found new ways of doing things, and new ways of having events, new ways of being creative. And even if we're not going to stay like this, but I think there is a possibility of taking a step change in some of these areas. And I would actually we're seeing it more than anywhere in the public sector. Telemedicine, the NHS went down the road to telemedicine without any of us almost noticing. In about 2 months in the spring, suddenly everything was online, and things that they had said were going to be impossible actually turned out to be perfectly possible. And I'm sure will continue in the future. So I don't know, Bill, do you think, what do you think is going to happen to the world of work? And do you think we are going to get, finally, having economists have waited a long time to have any kind of productivity growth in recent years, making more stuff with the same number of people? What do you think we're going to see from this?
Well, no, I think we are going to see something of a jump in productivity. I think that the issue about creativity has to be one that we pay attention to, which is that we often are creative together. When we're talking to one another randomly, serendipitously, companies famously set up so-called skunk works, where people, they put off the geeks into another place to come up with brilliant ideas together. We can't be very creative, I think, so isolated working from home. So there will be a hybrid solution. But my biggest hope is that this episode will throw off, at least for a while, the terrible technophobia that seemed to me to have taken hold. Economists like us were sort of lamenting that productivity wasn't rising. Too many other people were kind of predicting that productivity was going to rise, and it meant that everyone was going to lose their jobs, and that everyone's jobs, including yours and mine, were going to be taken by robots or artificial intelligence of one kind or another, which is such utter nonsense, in my view. And I hope this has thrown it out, and that we finally can grasp that actually technology is our friend and our assister in doing all of this, including artificial intelligence. I think this all kind of strengthens our activity, our creativity, our innovativeness, and I hope that the great achievements of our biological scientists will help to convince us of that, and the achievements of things like Zoom and other creatures of technology. So we need to become techno enthusiasts again.
Well, I know someone who particularly thinks that we should be embracing these kinds of innovations, and that's an economist called Charles Goodhew, who's written a book in the last few months with another economist, Manoj Pradhan. And I mention it because a lot of people have asked about the possibility of inflation coming down the track in this post-pandemic world. And their argument in their book, which they made before the pandemic, is that we are heading for inflation in part because of the demographic change we're facing. And when you say, when you talk to them about automation, they say, bring it on, because the real issue we're going to have as people get older across the world, along with many things, is going to be a shortage of people to do work, and particularly to support the older population. And the way they would put it was that you have to get people, you know, roll on the robots, because we are actually going to have a relative shortage of workers, even if people continue to work into much older age. I'm sure you and I are both planning to work for many more years. But even if we kind of go right into our dotage, if you look practically at the numbers, there's going to be a much smaller ratio of people working to people not in work. And the only way that the natural consequence of that is that wages start going up, inflation starts going up, because you've got a lot of work to do and not so many workers. I wonder what you think about that. So that's a sort of positive that would go with the positive story on automation, that we want automation, but it also suggests that, you know, has the pandemic actually going to give an extra reason to worry about inflation in the next few years, or is that just crazy? Because if you look at the financial markets at the moment, no one is expecting inflation.
No.
But do you think it's a possibility?
I don't think it is for that structural reason, but I do think clearly if we emerge with trade somewhat inhibited, travel inhibited, and sort of therefore some supply blockages, there's a possibility of inflation with an enormous amount of money being spent. But I think that's a pretty short-term phenomenon. I think in the long term, I don't think demographics is likely to be an inflation-inducing phenomenon. Perhaps I spend too much time in Japan, where 28% of the population is over the age of 65. They've got 70,000 people over the age of 100, and they have deflation, and they've had deflation for the last 20 years. I just don't think that there's that relationship. And so while I'm not saying I can predict what the inflation is going to be, I don't think demography is the reason you're likely to get it. But certainly working until much older is part of the solution. But then, as you say, lots of robots.
Well, it sounds like, I think Charles and Manoj will probably come on and do one of these talks, because I won't do justice to their argument, but they do have a response to the Japan point, and I think it's important enough for the future that maybe we should do one more round on it. So their response on that is to say Japan had the deflation, it had all these conditions of an aging population and falling, what we would say a falling dependency ratio, fewer workers for every retired person, but they had that, and when you was there at a time when the rest of the world still had very disinflationary situation. So you still had dependency ratio. You had actually more workers per retired person across the rest of the world. You had China entering the global marketplace, pushing down prices because its workers were much cheaper than everybody else's. And those, in effect, it was able to export a lot of its problems and import a lot of cheap goods and can still have deflation. But now, if the whole world is going through the kind of demographic change that you're getting, that we're seeing now, and you're getting, you know, the cost of workers is going up even in China. Can you count on that kind of disinflation continuing, or low inflation that we've had over the last few years?
Well, I suppose I go back to in the long run, we're all dead. I mean, I think this is a very long run question. The world population is still growing. It's projected to grow to well over 9 billion. So I don't think there's going to be a global shortage of labor. And meanwhile, we've got all this technology coming along to substitute for labor. So while theoretically it must be true in a sense that we are getting, you know, as countries age, we will reach a point where we're desperate, you know, about falling global population. But unless we retreat to protectionism and stop markets working, I don't see that that's going to be an overwhelming factor for inflation. Myself, in the sort of future that I can foresee over the next.
Well, the people in the financial markets who have trillions of dollars bet on the same outcome, I'm sure will be relieved.
Probably, yes, exactly. Probably. Now, we've only got about 4 minutes to go. Which other questions do you recommend? You've been combing through them.
There's so many. It's a classic. I think if I was teaching economics at Latymer, I'd be delighted with how active all of the students are. Who I know, actually, I'm looking at some of the names. They're not students at all. Some of them are pretty good at economics themselves. What's a good one? You should have a quick look and see if you can see.
We've got a couple of people asking about universal basic income. Is that the solution to inequality? And my answer to that would be no, because I don't think we can afford to pay enough to make that difference, and it has terrible incentive effects. So I think that we could invent intervention to support minimum wages, to try to reduce the gradient in the wage market is very important and may well be important. But we have universal basic income for people over the age of retirement. It's called pensions, and we find it incredibly hard to finance. Indeed, countries that have had public pay as you go pensions systems are now in crisis over that. I don't see universal basic income really working, but maybe you do, Stephanie.
No, I mean, I do think that there'll be more arguments around that, and I think we are certainly seeing. I think we will have more appetite for active increases of wages, whether through minimum wages or other ways. I suspect that there'll be a lot more of that. And actually, the UK's had an interesting experiment pushing up minimum wages further than many might have expected, and actually, it seems to have been. It hasn't boosted the productivity of these more expensive workers, which we thought it might do. Employers might say, okay, now we have to get more out of them. But nor has it caused a lot of job losses as far as we can see. So in that sense, it seems to be a good thing. I agree with you, but I think it speaks to a sort of more fundamental problem. If you start to separate people's identity from their income, or at least their livelihood, I think that does start to at the moment, that's a very difficult thing for our societies to do, because we are all very bound up with our identity is bound up with our jobs. And I think I was lucky enough to be at something with Bill Gates when we were chatting about this, and he thinks you have to just change the whole Protestant work ethic, that whole notion of that whole basis for our society would have to be rethought if you were going to.
Well, and I think, Stephanie's frozen, or at least I've lost her. I lost you for a moment, Stephanie, but I was going to butt in and say it's also the sort of solution that you can come up with if you think that you're, as it were, just running one country on its own. But unless you had this solution being adopted sort of worldwide somehow, then I think it would soon become unviable. Now, there are questions. I mean, other people here are asking who will pay for the extra government expenditures related to COVID and when. How much should we worry about debt is a sort of a final question, perhaps. I think we're going to probably finish quickly, but are we all doomed because of debt? I would say not on that either. I'm not a modern monetary theorist, but we're in an emergency. In this emergency, we can create this money. And I don't think that it's going to scar us for long, as long as we get growth going along and we get the innovation that generates growth. And my attention would be on creating that growth and creating that innovation, because that is what then produces the resources to repay our debt.
No, and I think that's one of the great things that I think was a positive from last year, that having had conversations among economists about whether or not we would have enough room, whether governments, having done all this for the financial crisis, in response to the financial crisis, would there be space to respond to the next recession, we asked ourselves. And I thought it was reassuring, and it was in some ways surprising that government so quickly jumped to really extraordinary fiscal measures and spending unheard of amounts, intervening unheard of amounts to respond to the crisis and to fill the hole, if you like, left in incomes by the halting of the economy. And that was absolutely the right thing to do. And I think it's one of the great things we've learned, and I think financial markets have learned relative to 2010, that the most important thing a government does is lay the basis for growth. And if you're doing it, and actually, and it doesn't make sense to be cutting corners at the key moments. You should borrow, and you should spend, and we should carry on doing that. I hope we don't stop too quickly, because growth is still the priority. For that scarring, I think, to be avoided. You're quite right.
No, I think that I agree with that, and I think almost certainly governments will try to withdraw support too quickly, and we have to argue against it. Just because their political kind of instincts are against letting the growth go and taking a risk on debt, and I think that it's very important to argue against that, including on spending about vaccines and the science, which I think is the great triumph of all of this.
Well, I don't know whether David or someone else is going to come on with the proverbial the shepherd's crook to pull us off at some point. But we have, I know that we, with these events, you have to promise to come out on time. So we should give those who thought it was going to finish at 8 o'clock the opportunity to leave, I suspect.
Thank you, Stephanie and Bill. I know we started a couple of minutes late, but we have actually now got to time. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insight with us this evening. It was absolutely captivating. And thank you to our wonderful audience for your great questions and continued support of our online talks over the last 6 months. And if you've missed any of the talks and would like to catch up at your leisure, you can copy out the link to our video library in the chat bar now. And as mentioned by David earlier, if you haven't already and would like to make a donation, please copy out that link also. Next Tuesday evening, we have a live interview with international portrait artist, Jonathan Yeo. Jonathan's work graces the walls of the world's leading galleries and museums, including the National Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery in Washington, DC, and the Museum of National History in Denmark, to name a few. Latymer parent and arts writer of the Financial Times, Peter Aspden, will discuss Jonathan's craft and the role of portraiture in the digital age, as well as its status in the past. And if you would like to join us for this fascinating insight into an artist's mind, please copy the forthcoming events link in the chat to find out more and register. Sadly, that brings us to the end of this evening's talk. As always, thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you both again, Bill and Stephanie, for this inspiring hour. I hope we'll see you all again very soon. Good night.